Welcome back to another AP US History video lecture. This time we're going to be talking about progressivism and progressive reforms. So this is really important, and it's a huge change in the way the American governmental system worked. It took place really around 1890 up until about 1920. And it has to do with a change from the laissez-faire belief in which the American government was really going to take a hands-off from the economy into a much more involved American government. Now, in the 1890s, there was sort of this spectrum between unions on the one hand and business leaders on the other. And then on the more radical side, there were groups like the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and Eugene Debs, who argued for a socialist change to the government, in which the government would move away from capitalism and establish a whole new type of economic and political system. Now, all of this really was about this question about whether or not the federal government should get involved in the economy. But there was a bigger issue in the 1890s that was really being asked. And the question was this, is the government even really laissez-faire, or is this just all an illusion? Remember, federal government stepped in on a number of the different union movements that took place, a number of different strikes, and used the military in order to crush them. Best example of that was the Pullman strike. So, for many radicals, the argument was, this whole notion of laissez-faire is an illusion, and nothing's ever going to change unless we have a whole new type of economy. Well, that brings up my thesis. The progressives really were a change in the way that we did things, and they were a dramatic change that kind of co-opted or took over the more radical argument. And the change in government that took place was due to both the conditions of industrialization, but also new ideas in science that were being applied to human behavior. Okay, so let's look at the conditions for change. In the early 1900s, there were a group of journalists that were called muckrakers. Now, actually, they got the name muckrakers from Teddy Roosevelt, which is going to be a little ironic because Teddy Roosevelt becomes a major progressive president. But he criticized these guys at the time. He said, you guys are a bunch of muckrakers because all you do is you rake the muck of society. In other words, you're always looking at the negative. You're never looking at the positive. Well, who were these guys? Well, let's give some examples. First off was Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell was the daughter of a father who had died because he had been competing with John Rockefeller, and Rockefeller had used unfair types of competitive practices like industrial espionage and industrial spying. And Ida Tarbell and her company, her father's company, had tried to compete against Rockefeller and lost, and he actually had a nervous breakdown and died. Tarbell exposed John Rockefeller for all of his unfair practices. Another man was Lincoln Steffens. Lincoln Steffens pointed out the poor housing that was taking place. Most people at the time were experiencing this huge burst of urbanization and suburbanization, but Steffens went into the new immigrant communities and kind of noticed how bad their housing was. There's David Phillips. David Phillips had noticed a corruption with the Senate, in which he was noticing that especially the railroads had provided a lot of bribery with senators. There was Upton Sinclair. He would be incredibly famous for his book, The Jungle. Now, The Jungle really was about Upton Sinclair going around the country and really working at odd jobs to see what it was like across the country for workers. Upton Sinclair himself was a socialist. But Sinclair, one of his most important chapters is the one on meat packing, which I'll get back to in this video lecture in just a little bit. That really had a huge change in government. And then last off is a man named Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis showed the divide between poor immigrants and this upcoming middle class in order to demonstrate really that there was another half in America who was living very poorly. One of the biggest things progressivism did was to have local reforms. Good example of that is in Wisconsin with the governor there, Robert Lafayette. There were a number of ways that they tried to get people directly involved in politics. So typically, your local legislature is the one that gets to vote on things. So you vote for the local legislature, they go in and they create laws, right? Except there was a desire to try to create more direct democracy for people. So there were a number of things that were created at the time to do this. A good example was the initiative. The initiative allowed people, after they voted for the representatives, to vote on a law that could be passed outside of their representatives doing this. There's the referendum. So let's say our local legislature decides to pass a law that we don't like a lot. The referendum actually allows us to vote on whether or not to get rid of that law. Then there's the recall, similar to the referendum, except the recall has to do with politicians themselves. Once we put somebody into office, typically you have to wait until the end of their term, not with the recall. The recall would allow us to get rid of that individual from office because we feel afterwards they just aren't doing a good job or they're corrupt. Another huge change that takes place is in science and the professional fields. So in the 1890s and afterwards, there's a creation of numerous different professional fields based upon science, like psychology, sociology, and economics. In fact, at the local level in a lot of cities, there were the creation of expert boards in which basically people were going to manage cities based upon their scientific expertise. Also at this time, there was a change in the overall philosophy about human nature itself. So up until now, the basic belief had been that human nature was something that was transcendent, meaning it goes across ages. But during the 1890s and early 1900s, there was a belief in something called historicism, meaning that human beings changed in each historical period. Each historical period had a different context, and that influenced the way that human beings evolved and developed. This led into the notion of developing public policy based upon science. Now, there's a darker side to this. This might all sound really good, right? I mean, what's the bad thing about using science to determine things? It helps us to solve problems. But actually, science can also be used to categorize people, and sometimes not in the best of ways. For example, in the 1890s, there was an attempt to categorize people based upon race, and this fit into what was called eugenics or scientific racism. A really good example of this was Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is oftentimes held up as a hero, and she's held up as a hero because she wanted to have women be able to have reproductive rights and be able to use things like birth control. She also believed, though, in establishing eugenics, the idea that you could pass out birth control to the sort of like unwanted people. And oftentimes these were people of so-called lower races or different immigrant status. She eventually established Planned Parenthood, which is around still today. Planned Parenthood definitely does not hold this belief system anymore. But back at that time period, Margaret Sanger really did promote the idea of trying to control certain unwanted populations. That gets to our major federal changes that takes place, especially with our two big progressive presidents. So the first is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt initially, like I said, was against the muckrakers. He was the one who came up with the whole term. All they do is go out and rake the muck. But eventually he changed his mind, and that had to do going back to that book, Upton Sinclair. So here's the way the story went. Teddy Roosevelt was a big guy, and he enjoyed his breakfast in the morning. Supposedly on one occasion he went down to get his breakfast, and as he was eating his breakfast, he's reading this book, The Jungle, and he comes across this one section in The Jungle that talks about how meat was packed. And the way that the passage read was that meat would be taken and all the extras would fall into the corners, and when they fell into the corners, you would get water falling on it. You would get mold on it. You would actually have rats running over it. And then people would just take that meat and they would just throw it into the hopper and create more sausage. Well, Teddy Roosevelt just happened to be eating sausage at the time. Supposedly, he took his plate and threw it out the window of the White House. And he was so upset that he called for major reforms and regulations. He called for a program called the 3 C's. They included consumer protection, basic laws to protect the consumer and to give them information, corporate control, a breakdown of monopolies, and also conservation. Conservation was an attempt to regulate our usage of the natural environment so that we would have natural resources in the future. Now, this is actually really important because there are two movements that are going to happen at this time period. One is called conservation, which we just talked about. That's regulation of natural resources for use in the future. That was led largely by a man named Gifford Pinchot. We also have preservation, and preservation was the belief that the natural environment simply should be preserved for itself. It just is inherently good. The guy who leads that is a man named John Muir. Well, this eventually led to Teddy Roosevelt leading and eventually passing major laws like the Pure Food and Drug Act, which gave people information about the types of foods and drugs that they were taking in. The Hepburn Act, which regulated railroads. And the Meat Inspection Act, which would also provide information on and regulation of meat packing, going back to that excerpt from The Jungle. So one of the other big things Teddy Roosevelt did was to mediate on the side of workers and unions. While it didn't really officially recognize unions, it was the first time that unions had support at the federal level. And a good example of that is at a strike called the Anthracite Coal Strike, where Teddy Roosevelt mediated and actually stood in on the side of the workers. Now, the next president was a man named William Howard Taft. Roosevelt chose him, and the reason why this happened was Roosevelt had originally been the vice president to William McKinley. McKinley was assassinated right after he was elected in 1900, and so Roosevelt served out his term and then served a second term in 1904. He could have served another term if he wanted to, but Roosevelt chose not to, and he decided to retire. At that point, Taft became the next president, and actually Taft did more trust busting than Teddy Roosevelt did. The most famous was he went after the Northern Securities industry, which is a railroad monopoly, which was in the Southwest, owned by Andrew Carnegie. But there were a number of things that happened that got Roosevelt kind of concerned. For one, William Howard Taft raised tariffs under the Payne-Aldrich Bill. Now, this is actually a little bit of an illusion. The Payne-Aldrich Bill actually was an attempt to lower tariffs, but in all the compromises that took place, he was able to lower major tariffs, but the overall tariff rate actually went up. Then Taft fired Gifford Pinchot when Pinchot stood in the way of creating the Hetch Hetchy Valley Dam up in Yosemite. At that point, Roosevelt was furious and ran against him in 1912 for the Republican nomination. Roosevelt failed to get that nomination, so he left the Republican Party and he formed the Bull Moose Progressive Party. Because there were two people running on the Republican side, that allowed for a Democrat to come in. Why? Because the vote was split, and that was Woodrow Wilson. Wilson argued, as a progressive president, for something similar to Teddy Roosevelt, but slightly different. Teddy Roosevelt had always believed that there were good monopolies and bad monopolies. Bad monopolies were simply the ones that did not provide for fair competition. Wilson argued for something called the New Freedom, in which he argued all big organizations are basically bad. And so many of his laws attempted to break things down. For example, the Clayton Antitrust Act. That one complemented the Sherman Antitrust Act and tried to break down all monopolies. Another example was the Underwood Tariff Act, which attempted to lower tariffs to create more international competition. Another example was the Progressive Income Tax, the 16th Amendment, which was an attempt to break down the centralization of wealth. And then last off was the Federal Reserve Act, very important for what we talked about, which was meant to break down J.P. Morgan's control over the banks by creating a new institution that would regulate the banks called the Federal Reserve. Okay, what are our takeaways? Number one, progressivism was a movement based upon reform, but also the use of scientific ideas of history to move in a new direction. Number two, what is this new direction? The federal government was now seen as a tool for breaking down monopolistic control of the economy. And last off, number three, the legacy of the progressives is clouded in many ways still by scientific racism and eugenics. Okay, see you in class.